Today I want to talk about something that I think will really satisfy the chord nerds among you. I know you're out there, chord nerds. I'm one of you. Okay, what we're going to be doing is looking at the way that chord loops and mini progressions kind of work, the way they're engineered, what powers them. So a chord loop is a short sequence of chords which you can loop round and round and round, and which often can form the basis of a song. So these days, absolutely the most popular chord loop is 1-5-6-4. It gets used again and again and again, and we'll explore the peculiar power of the 1-5-6-4, what gives it its strange inner tension, a little bit later in the tutorial. Mini progressions are often very short sequences of chords that crop up regularly in larger progressions. So a very common one is 2-5-1. And one that crops up very often in jazz is 1-1-7-4-4 minor. While we're on the subject of music theory, as part of today's tutorial, I'm going to be using this amazing little gizmo, which is the Chord decoder. Now, this has been sent to me by Noisy Clan, who are a great little business based up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, not very far from here, and they make loads of bits and pieces for musicians. Let me get it on this camera so we can look at it in a bit more detail. Basically, it's a rotating circle of fifths. Okay, but you can do various things with it because it's got all these magic windows that allow you to use it kind of as a ready reckoner for working out chord progressions. So for example, say you wanted to know what the 1-5-6-4 progression was in the key of, I know, let's think of something weird. Let's go into A flat. Not that weird, but a bit weird. So what I've done is just position A flat at the top of the wheel there, and now I can see, looking at the right windows, 1, 5, 6 and 4, A flat, E flat, F minor and D flat. Really quick and easy. There's also a little window that tells me exactly how many flats or sharps are in the key, so you can work out the scales using this if you want to. And you can also use it for things like figuring out the circle of fifths. So if you're using secondary dominants, tertiary dominants, all stuff we're going to be talking about later in the tutorial, you can just spin the wheel and work those out. It's also incredibly handy for working out your own chord progressions, actually, either kind of semi-randomly, or you can just take existing progressions and try reordering the numbers. Yeah, super useful, so check it out. By the way, with the decoder comes this brilliant little book which explains how it works, but also covers quite a bit of basic music theory. We're getting shot though? We're getting shot. Good, so do check it out. Noisy Clan have lots of great products. Another one of theirs I really like is their cheat sheet of piano chords and keys. I just saw it on their website after they'd sent me the decoder and said, that looks cool, can you send it to me? And they did. So go and check their stuff out. You won't be surprised to hear that I've got a discount code. If you go to noisyclan.com and buy any of their stuff, just put the discount code BILL20 in at the checkout and you will get 20% off, okay? But equally, you can just use the links in the description text down below. Like I said, we're going to be using the decoder a bit more in this tutorial, so you can see it in action in just a minute or two. So let's kick off by looking at the 1-5-6-4 chord loop. Like I said, this is the basis of literally thousands of pop songs. Let me improvise through the progression just a couple of times in the key of C major. Here we go. Okay, so I was kind of playing around a little bit there using a couple of chord extensions and suspensions, but nothing tremendously complicated. Let's just think about the very basic mechanics. So we're in the key of C major. Here is the scale of C major. All of the white notes between any two Cs on the piano keyboard, really, really easy to remember. And the 1-5-6-4 basically just consists of what we call the diatonic chords built off the first, the fifth, the sixth and the fourth degrees of that scale. Okay, so if we build those chords as we always do with diatonic chords using a simple triad shape like that, and only using the notes of the scale to build the chords, that gives us the chords C, G, A minor and F. 1, 5, 6, 4. Clearly we're not always playing them in those very simple root position inversions because that would sound weird. What we're doing is taking the notes that build the chords up and kind of reorganizing the shapes of the chords so they lock together more naturally. Adding an extension every now and then, just like we are doing there, to create A minor 7. It also works in every other major key. So let's think about 1, 5, 6, 4 in the key of F major. There's our scale of F major, all the white notes between any two Fs on the piano keyboard, except when we get to a B, we make it a B flat. Now we could just work out the 1, 5, 6, 4 using that scale, but for speed, let's use the decoder. So I'm just going to put F at the top, so that's the key we're in, and if we look in the right windows we can see 1, 5, 6, 4, F, C, D minor and B flat. Okay, so those are our 1, 5, 6, 4 chords in the key of F major. Let's just play through them. Like I said, because it's a loop, the 1, 5, 6, 4 will just go round and round and round and round. Why is it so popular? Why does this get used in so many thousands of pop songs? Basically, I think there are two reasons. The first and the most obvious reason is that the 1, 5, 6, 4 very easily gives rise to really strong, clear bass lines. So let's look at it again in the key of F major. Here's F with an F in the bass. And then our next chord is C, but we're going to put its third note, E, in the bass. So that means that the whole chord is in its first inversion, if you want the technical terminology. Then we've got D minor, and we're going to put D in the bass. And then B flat with a B flat in the bass. And that little gap there between the D and the B flat, we can either just jump, or we can add a C as a passing note. Both very common solutions. So it's given us a lovely clear bass line that basically just goes down the major scale. Okay, other bass lines can also be used with the 1, 5, 6, 4. For example, it also works if you go from F the other way up the scale. So one of the great strengths of this progression, one of the things that makes it such a satisfying loop, is that it very easily gives us these powerful but simple bass lines. The other reason I think 1, 5, 6, 4 is so powerful is more subtle, and actually it forms a contrast and even a bit of tension with the obviousness of those bass lines. Yeah, okay. And what it is that the links between these chords are not always what our ear might expect them to be. Yeah, let's just break down what I mean. We'll start with 1, the tonic chord, F in the key of F major. And from there we go to 5, the dominant chord, C in the key of F major. Now that's perfectly standard, okay? Exactly the sort of tonic to dominant journey that crops up in zillions of pieces of music, from, like, you know, nursery rhymes to symphonies to rock anthems. Okay, just in case you're not familiar with that terminology, by the way, in any major key, tonic is just another name for the 1 chord, so F in F major, and dominant is another term for the 5 chord, C in F major. But what happens next is a little bit surprising. Not to your conscious mind perhaps, because you know what chord is coming next, but to your innate musical sense, to your ear. What your ear, and that means anyone's ear, whether they're a trained musician or not, expect after a dominant chord is a return to the tonic, to the 1 chord. So we expect to go 1, 5, and back to 1. And that's because taking us back to the tonic, taking us back to the 1 chord, is the primary function of the dominant chord, of the 5 chord. So in the key of F major, when you have a C chord, it really wants to take us back to 1. And when it does do that, you get what's called a perfect cadence, or sometimes an authentic cadence, a 5-1 resolution. But that's not what we get here. Instead, from the 5 chord, we go to the 6 chord. Now, by going from the dominant, from the 5, to a chord that is not the 1 chord, and specifically by going to the 6 chord, D minor, we get what we call an interrupted or a deceptive cadence. We're not getting quite what our ear expects. Now, interrupted cadences are massively common, yeah? And when you hear one, you don't kind of sit up and say, OMG, that sounds weird, but they do give a slight push against what your ear expects. From the start of the progression, we go 1 to 5, perfectly normal, perfectly expected, but then from 5 to 6, not quite what we expected, just a little bit of tension is introduced into the progression. And then, here's the real magic, a similar thing happens again. So from the D minor chord, from the 6 chord, we go to the 4 chord, B flat in the key of F major, which again is perfectly normal. But then from the 4 chord, we go straight back to the 1 chord for the start of the loop. So we can run it all the way around again. And again, that's slightly defying expectations because the function, the typical job of the 4 chord, B flat in the key of F major, it has what we call a subdominant or predominant function. It is itself the subdominant chord, but its function, its job is also called subdominant. So its job is to lead us towards a dominant chord. So a natural thing to do would be to go from a 4 chord, B flat, to a 5 chord, C. And thence back to a 1 chord. But instead, we get a 4-1 resolution, sometimes called a plagal or a church cadence. Again, it's massively common, yeah, nothing here would make you kind of jump out of your skin and think, whoa, that's weird. But still, it's not quite what your musical instinct expects. So in those 4 short chords, let's stick in F major for now, we've got unity in the form of that very clear bass line, or the opportunity for that very clear bass line. But we've also got these little kind of touches of tension and the unexpected. And that's what gives the whole progression its kind of unexpected power and drive. Let's very quickly try it in another key. Let's flip out the decoder for speed and go around to, let's go to D, okay? So straight away we can look in our little window and see that the scale of D major has, is that focusing? That's focusing, has an F sharp and a C sharp. So all the white notes on a piano keyboard between 2 Ds, but when we come across an F we sharpen it, and when we come across a C we sharpen it, okay? And we can see our 1, 5, 6, 4 is D, A, B minor and G. What I'll do is, I'll just improvise through that again. I'll do it twice. And first time I will, in the bass line, I'll go down the scale, okay? And the second time in the bass line, I'll go up the scale, so you can kind of hear the differences. Here we go. So very, very kind of powerful and cohesive, that remarkable kind of wistful sound that 1564 has, really in evidence there. Now here's a really interesting thing. Today, 1564 is the dominant chord progression in pop music. You know, if you listen to any, I don't know, Taylor Swift song at random, there's a really good chance that it is going to have a 1564 chord progression in there somewhere. It might be pure 1564 all the way through, or it might use it for the verse or the chorus or whatever, but it is super common. You stick a radio station on that's playing pop music, you probably won't have to wait very long before you'll hear 1564. But it wasn't always the case. If you go back in time, kind of 60, 70, 80 years, back in those days, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was a hugely vibrant pop music scene, but 1564, the Taylor Swift progression, air quotes, just wasn't used. I can't think of a single song from that era, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, if you can think of any, stick it in the comments. I can't think of a single song from that era that uses 1564. Instead, the most common chord progression was, wait for it, 1, 6, 4, 5. Exactly the same chords, but in a very slightly different order. Let's look at it in F major to start with. So we know our 1564 is F, C, D minor, B flat, But the 1, 6, 4, 5, like I said, same chords, different order. F, D minor, B flat, C. If you've ever heard anyone sit down at a piano, like at school or college or whatever, and just do this, that's the 1, 5, 6, 4, okay? Super, super common. It's sometimes called the 50s progression because it got used in a lot of doo-wop back in the 1950s. It's sometimes called the heart and soul progression or the Blue Moon progression after famous songs that it's been in. And it is very, very common indeed. Let's take a look at it in a different key. Let's go into B flat, actually. Let's use the decoder because B flat is one of the most common keys it appeared in. There we go, we've got B flat at the top there. So we know in the scale of B flat, it's all the white notes between any two Bs, but when we get to a B or an E, we flatten them. So obviously that includes the tonic note, the one note. Here's our scale. And our 1, 6, 5 and 4 chords, I've got to think every time I say it so as not to get the two mixed up, are B flat, G minor, E flat and F. Yeah, let's just play them through. Okay, now often when those are played in kind of music of that era, kind of jazz influenced music in particular, they are extended, okay, diatonically. If you're not quite sure what that means, check out the links below. I'll make sure to include a tutorial that goes through chord extension and stuff. And that gives you chords like B flat major 7, G minor 7, or G minor 9, E flat major 7 and F7, or some kind of substitution for F7, like, you know, a tritone substitution or something like that, kind of beyond the scope of this tutorial. So hugely popular songs like, you know, Blue Moon, late 1930s, that was written, use that progression, and it's kind of very mellow and chilled out. Let me just improvise through it a couple of times. I'll use a stride bass in the left hand, kind of typical of that period. Okay, so really easy and really kind of fun to play around with. Now the weird thing is that the 1, 5, 6, 4 and the 1, 6, 4, 5 are very similar. Same number of chords, same chords, just a slightly different order. But they are in some ways completely different, and one has replaced the other, yeah? So 60, 70, 80 years ago, then 1, 6, 4, 5, the 50s progression was everywhere. Today it's used much less. Okay, whereas 1, 5, 6, 4, the Taylor Swift progression, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, basically wasn't used. I can't easily think of a song from, say, the 40s or 50s that used it. If you can, let me know in the comments. And that's a really interesting question. Why is that? In fact, I was trying to think of an example of a recent song that uses 1, 6, 4, 5, and it still does get used. They're still out there. The first one that sprang to mind, and don't laugh at this, was the theme song from Paw Patrol. Paw Patrol, Paw Patrol, whenever there is trouble. If you have children under the age of 15, you'll know only too well about Paw Patrol. Another really good example is I Will Always Love You. And I, will always love you. You can see why they got Whitney Houston to sing it rather than me. Anyway, so it does get used, okay, but it tends to be used, in general, there are exceptions to this, it tends to be used for songs that are positive and reassuring. And that's maybe because of its clearer structure. Okay, because 1, 6, 4, 5 always ends on a 5 chord. So in B flat major always ends on an F chord, which takes us in a very neat journey back to B flat. It doesn't defy our expectations in the way that 1, 5, 6, 4 does, the Taylor Swift progression. Okay, and so the 50s progression really suited music back in the days when the progression was at its peak, you know, 30s, 40s, 50s, mid-20th century, because back then popular music was mostly love songs and schmaltz and happy endings. If, on the other hand, you think about contemporary pop, and especially ballad type and indie and singer-songwriter forms of pop, then what you will see there, I think, is a greater seriousness of subject matter. Okay, there's more introspection, there's much more personal songwriting going on than the kind of Moon June croon songwriting of the 30s and 40s. If you think about pop today in those terms, then the slight ambiguity, the unexpectedness, the kind of convention-defying internal structure of 1-5-6-4 suddenly seems a much better fit. Let's think about it in B flat, the key we've just been looking at 1-6-4-5 in. 1, 5, 6, 4. There's a really nice extension. E flat major 9. Okay, that kind of sound which has slightly more ambiguity, slightly more unexpectedness in terms of what our ear might be looking for. That convention-defying kind of structure of 1-5-6-4 seems to be a much better fit for contemporary songwriting than the kind of solidity of the 50s progression. Yeah. So we can see the way harmony works in even seemingly simple, ubiquitous chord loops can spin out into big musical effects. Moving on, let's have a look at some mini progressions and the way that they are engineered. Just a reminder, by a mini progression, well, that's a term that I'm using as a kind of shorthand to mean very short sequences of chords that you often find slotted into longer progressions, either because they do a particular job or just because they're idiomatic within the particular genre of song you're dealing with. Okay, so the classic example of a mini progression is 2-5-1. And one that is kind of relevant to a genre, one which you find in a genre a great deal, is 1-1-7-4-4 minor, which crops up loads and loads in jazz. Now we'll come to those slightly more complex non-diatonic examples in a moment, but before we do, let's take a look at 2-5-1 because it is very simple and it's really quite straightforward and common. And let's have a look at it in the key of E flat major. Here is the scale of E flat major. And if we want to find the 2-5-1 in that key, we can just use the scale. We can go for the second note of the scale for 2, the fifth note of the scale for 5, and the tonic note of the scale, the first note of the scale for 1. Yeah. Or if we want to be quick, we can use the decoder. And there we have it. I have it set on E flat already, and you can see 2, 5, 1, F minor, B flat, E flat. Now, because 2-5-1 is so very often used in the context of jazz and blues, but also in kind of popular music from the mid-20th century that was heavily kind of inspired by jazz and blues or inflected with it. What I'm going to do is enrich those chords a little bit just by sticking diatonic sevenths on each of them. Okay, so we've got our basic 2-5-1. Or to play it in more kind of natural interlocking inversions. Okay, because when we choose our chord voicings, our chord inversions, we always go for a natural flow if we can, unless we want a really jumpy effect. But let's look at those chords in root position again, because that's how we calculate the sevenths. What we do is play each of those chords in its root position, and then going up the scale of the key, E flat in this case, we just go up 3 from the top note. So here's our 2 chord, F minor. And if we go up 3 notes to the scale from its top note, that takes us to E flat. As an F minor 7 chord. Let's do the same with the 5 chord. There's our 5 chord, B flat, and let's go up 1, 2, 3. Gives us B flat 7. And if we do the same thing with the tonic chord, here's our E flat chord in root position, 1, 2, 3, always counting the first note when we calculate intervals. Okay, really important. 1, 2, 3, E flat major 7. Yeah, so that gives us just a slightly richer sound. And if we wanted to, let me just put a bass note in there. And we can extend those chords further. We can do things like add diatonic ninths. So that would be something like. Now, one of the reasons 2-5-1 is so popular and the way it works so naturally in progressions is that it absolutely goes with the flow of chord function. So if you think of the number 2 chord, that has what we call a subdominant or predominant function. So it naturally wants to take us to a dominant chord, which it does, the 5 chord, the dominant chord, and the 5 chord, its function is naturally to take us to the 1 chord, the tonic. Okay, so we're going subdominant, predominant, call it what you like, dominant, and then tonic. The terminology does get confusing because as well as subdominant type chords, we also have the subdominant chord, which is the 4 chord, and as well as you know we have tonic type chords, which is the 1 chord, the 3 chord, and the 6 chord, but we have the tonic chord. So it's handy just to say type at the end if you're referring to the function, but that's kind of a big subject to get into here, so we'll leave it for now. But that is one of the reasons that 2-5-1 flows so naturally, because it works absolutely with the chord function. It's not like, if you think back to 1-5-6-4, that defied the function of the chords, and that to some extent gave it its kind of tension and its power. But here we're going very naturally with the flow of the chords. Now, one of the reasons that 2-5-1 is so popular in jazz and blues is that it really lends itself to chord substitution, where you take the basic underlying progression, the basic 2-5-1, and you elaborate it, and you maybe even swap it out and put different chords in. Okay, so if we look at our basic 2-5-1 in E flat, here we go. There are other things that I could do there as well. I could do something like this. Okay, so there, instead of the 5 chord, I played an F diminished 7 with a B flat in the bass, and it still had the same function. Okay, let's think of another example. We could go 2, and then instead of the 5 chord, we could use a tritone substitution, which in the key of E flat would mean playing an E7 chord in the right and probably a B flat in the bass. There's all kinds of things you can do, and the 2-5-1 lends itself because the 2 chord often flows very naturally into the type of chords that are substituted to create that kind of sound, if you see where I'm coming from. Something else that's worth mentioning here, just as we did when we were thinking about 1-5-6-4, it's worth considering the character of the individual chords that we're dealing with because they do have an effect on the music. If you think about the 2-5-1, then we're going from a minor chord, slightly kind of given a little bit more of a major tinge if we play it as a minor 7, but a minor chord fundamentally going to a major chord, going to major chord. The 2 chord has, like I said, a subdominant function, but it's not the only chord with a subdominant function. The other one is the 4 chord, A flat, in the key of E flat major. So we could play a 4-5-1 progression as well. And it has exactly the same kind of, functionally it's identical. And in fact, if you think about the 1-6-4-5 loop, it has a 4-5-1 built into it, assuming that you actually loop it round. So here we go. Let's play that just with the most simple chords without any possible extensions. Okay, so when do we choose a 4-5-1 and when do we choose a 2-5-1? Because both of them are going from a subdominant function to a dominant function to a tonic function. Well, really, you can swap them about, and in most cases it won't make that much of a difference. But the 2-5-1 is arguably just that little bit richer, because again, if we take it back to the basic chords, if we go minor, major, major, we have that slight bit of contrast, whereas if we're going major, 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 the celebrated Catch-22 character, it's just kind of relentlessly bright all the way through. Yeah, so that little tinge of minor rising into major, getting a little bit of a lift, gives it a little bit more character, I think. If you wanted a very bright, kind of in-your-face, kind of upbeat, positive sound, then you might go 4-5-1, and that works perfectly well in the 50s progression. But I think the 2-5-1 is popular, first of all, because it flows naturally into substitutions, like I said, but also because it has that very slightly more thoughtful sound. Okay, so sticking with this kind of broadly jazzy, bluesy style, let's think about some mini progressions that use non-diatonic chords and secondary dominants. Let's just define some terms quickly. So a non-diatonic chord is just a chord that doesn't appear in the list of 7 chords that you can grow out of the scale of a key. So here's the scale of E flat major. Diatonic chords are the ones we get if we take a simple root position triad shape and run it up the scale just using the scale notes to build the chords. And back to 1 at the top of the scale. And in any piece of music, say it's in the key of E flat, most of the chords will be taken from that list of diatonics, okay? So a non-diatonic chord is one that isn't in that list of chords. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm also saying that non-diatonic chords are chords that do appear in that list, but which have extensions that aren't in the scale. To explain what I mean, let's just go into C where things are a bit clearer. So there's a scale of C major well established. Imagine we're playing an F chord in the scale in the key of C major. Now let's say that we make that a 7th, but instead of going for the diatonic major 7th, we put the E flat on to create a dominant 7th chord. Okay, that's F7. So while F by itself is diatonic to the key of C major, F7 isn't, because that E flat doesn't appear in the scale. Okay, so that's non-diatonic chords. Secondary dominants, I'll discuss in a second. Let's listen to this little bit of progression that I'm going to play first. What I want to imagine, we'll stay in C major, is that we are playing a blues in the key of C major, and the start of any 12-bar blues is always going to be the 1 chord and the 4 chord in some form or another. And then in the simplest form of 12-bar blues, you would go out to the 5 chord, and then to some form of the 4 chord, and then resolve back to the 1 chord. But in some forms of the blues, particularly what's known as the New Orleans blues, you go through a circle of fifths using secondary and indeed tertiary dominants, which are non-diatonic chords. Let me demonstrate that, because that's the easiest way to make sense of it. So you're playing a 12-bar blues, you've been from 1 to 4 and back again, you know, maybe a couple of times, and you're on your 1 chord. But then as the kind of second half of the 12-bar progression you know, gets underway, you jump out to an A7 chord, and then you play a D7 chord, and then a G chord, G7, which of course is the dominant chord, the 5 chord in the key of C major. So let's just play through that. Imagine we're kind of halfway through our 12-bar blues. We just wrapped up with a 1-1-7-4-4 minor there. So let's look at what was going on. Clearly in the key of C major, the chords A7 and D7 are not diatonic. What we have going on there is secondary dominance, and indeed a tertiary dominant coming down the circle of fifths. Now we can make sense of this using the decoder actually, which is quite a good way of doing it. So let's go into C major. Here we go, all the way around. We'll come to that in a second. So from our C chord, we went to an A7 chord. Now, if we go round the circle of fifths here, we can see the A start to appear. Okay, so there's A, it's several steps around the circle of fifths, and that A is a fifth, the interval of a fifth above the next chord in the progression, D7, okay, and we can see the D chord beginning to creep into our circle of fifths here using the decoder. The D chord is the actual secondary dominant in the key of C major. The way this string of dominants works is you get the A7 chord, which strongly wants to resolve down a fifth to the D chord, but that's a D7 as well, so it strongly wants to resolve down a fifth. You can see it's starting to come down the circle of fifths here to the G chord, and then, or G7, and then that takes us back to the E. So we're back to the C, sorry. So we're still getting back to the tonic chord, but we're doing it in a much more kind of colourful way. Okay, so we're heading out to the tertiary dominant, A, all the way around there, then to the secondary dominant, then to the dominant, dominant, and then to the C. And sometimes you hear people talking about the fifth of the fifth, or the dominant of the dominant, or the fifth of the fifth of the fifth, in the case of a tertiary dominant, or the dominant of the dominant of the dominant. And like a lot of music theory, it all starts to get tremendously complicated and wordy until you just kind of listen to it. Something you might have noticed, by the way, is the way that that little circle of fifth stuff creates a lovely clear bass line. Am I going to stay in shot? I'm going to stay in shot. So let's imagine we've gone from our C chord. Watch my left hand. Yeah, and then we are ready for the C. And that D especially, you can do a really nice bit of kind of chromatic colour between the F and the F sharp there. Okay, so another very common non-diatonic progression in jazz is the one we've mentioned a couple of times already, 1-1-7-4-4 minor. You've probably heard this a zillion times, because it just crops up in so many songs of that era. Morning all, it's Editing Bill here. When I was shooting the video, I forgot to mention that I often call this the Saints progression, because one of the earliest songs it turns up in is when the Saints go marching in. I wanna be in that number when the Saints go marching in. There we go, back to the video. Again, this is circle of fifth stuff at work, but in a slightly more subtle way, okay? So do it in C major. We start with the tonic chord, C, then we move it to C7, which is a non-diatonic dominant chord in effect that resolves strongly to the chord a fifth below, which is F. So you might think that was setting up for a key change, but instead of settling on the F, as if it were a key change, we go to F minor. And then that F minor chord resolves out always really nicely to something involving a G, and you can see why that might be, because we've got the F and the A flat there circling around that G. So whatever comes next usually involves a G, and there are a couple of things you can do there. You can either play a C chord with a G in the bass, and then do something like, or you can play a straightforward G chord. That's a very kind of common thing in early rock and roll and stuff like that. You could just go back to an ordinary root position C chord, it wouldn't sound ridiculous. Okay, not crazy wrong, but it doesn't kind of have the flow that something with a G in seems to give it. And again, it's a very kind of natural flow, that 1-1-7-4-4 minor, and it has quite a bit of colour, but also kind of an innate tidiness and neatness that takes us in a very logical way to the tonic at the end of the song, so we can loop around the progression again. And that's what made it very popular with jazz songwriters. It was and blues songwriters, and indeed rock and roll songwriters in the early days. It's very much part of that idiom, a very natural sound. And again, it gives us a really nice bass line. Okay team, so we've done a lot of heavy thinking today and not actually an enormous amount of playing, but hopefully that's transmitted some pretty useful ideas to you. If you are going to get one of these decoders, by the way, they are super useful. Like I say, 20% off using my discount code, or the link Bill20, or the link in the description text down below. There's loads of other things you can do with them. I mean, as I said in the introduction, there's almost too much to go into here, but you can also kind of develop your own chord progressions. Quite a nice way of doing that is just by inverting progressions that are on there. So a nice little feature it has on the back actually is this suggested chord progression thing. You kind of just whip round and it gives you chord progression after chord progression after chord progression, little loops of 4 chords, with lots of different options. Or like I said, you can take your 1-5-6-4 and say to yourself, well, what happens if I play 1-4-6-5? Interesting question. Yeah, so that's just kind of an inversion of the loop, much more stable, interestingly enough. So loads and loads of different ways that you can play around with this. Of course, you can do it manually as well. You can, figure out the diatonic chords of a key, C major, F major, E flat major, whatever. It gets a little bit more complicated in minor keys, okay? But so I would start with major keys to start with. And and just, you know, pick some random numbers, see what happens. But this just kind of helps to visualize it, so do check out their stuff. Comes with that great book, and also, like I said, this really handy, actually really handy cheat sheet of chords. I so wish stuff like that, I mean, I wish so much of this stuff had been available when I was a kid. Like, imagine YouTube videos when I was 14 or 15. I had to work it all out for myself, or, you know, with sort of tips from friends. But just something like this would be incredibly useful. So yeah, so there we go. Hope you enjoyed it. By the way, if you are not signed up to my Patreon, you might also like my Patreon, because there's lots of cool stuff on there. Patreon.com/Bill Hilton. I post very regularly exclusive material. Do check it out. Brilliant. So if you've enjoyed that, head off right now and take a look at the Noisy Clown website. Remember, Bill20 will get you 20% off anything you happen to buy there, and they do ship all over the world. Okay, so there we go. If you're looking for something else to do with chords next, maybe something a bit practical, take a look at this video, which I think you will find really interesting.